My mother-in-law looked straight at my 6-month-old daughter and shouted, "Take your daughter and get out." In that instant I knew Christmas was ruined. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply picked up my little girl, grabbed the diaper bag and walked toward the front door. I believed that would be the last time we would ever spend a holiday together. I never imagined that less than 30 minutes later, one forgotten Christmas card with my baby's tiny handprint would leave my mother-in-law in tears in front of the entire family. What happened that night changed every one of us, so stay with me until the end. My name is Greer. I'm 28 years old, and 8 months before that Christmas, I lost my husband, Blaine. Losing him shattered my world, but I still had one precious gift: our daughter Lumi. She was only 6 months old, and every smile on her face reminded me of the man we both loved. Even through my grief, I wanted her to know the family her father came from. That wasn't easy because Blaine's mother, Marlene, never accepted me after his death. She believed I was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. No matter how cold she became, I kept showing up with kindness because I thought it was the right thing to do. I hoped that our first Christmas without Blaine might soften her heart and bring everyone together. Instead, I walked into that house carrying hope, gifts, and a quiet prayer that our family could finally begin to heal. I had no idea that before the day ended, I would experience the deepest humiliation of my life, and an innocent gift from my baby would reveal a truth no one at that dinner table was prepared to face. When Lumi and I arrived at Marlene's house, Christmas music drifted through the open doorway, and colorful lights covered every corner of the porch. The house looked warm and welcoming from the outside, exactly the kind of place where families should gather to celebrate. I balanced a casserole I had spent hours preparing in one hand while carrying a bag filled with neatly wrapped presents in the other. Tucked safely between the gifts was the one item that meant more to me than anything else: a handmade Christmas card with Lumi's tiny red handprint pressed onto the front. The paint had dried a little unevenly because she kept curling her fingers, but that only made it more special. On the back of the card, I had written a simple message as though it came from her. It read, "Grandma, I love you even when you're mad. Merry Christmas. Love, Lumi." I smiled as I read it one last time before slipping it back into the envelope. Deep down, I hoped those innocent words might reach a place in Marlene's heart that grief had closed off. For a brief moment, I convinced myself the afternoon might be different. That hope disappeared almost immediately. Marlene barely looked at me when I stepped inside. Instead of greeting me, she glanced at the casserole and asked whether I had followed the recipe correctly because the last one I made had been too dry. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks, but nobody responded. I quietly placed the dish in the kitchen and pretended her remark hadn't hurt. As more family members arrived, the comments continued. Marlene looked me up and down before saying I looked exhausted and should have made more of an effort for Christmas. A little later, she brought up one of Blaine's old girlfriends, smiling as she talked about how elegant and sophisticated she had always been. The comparison wasn't subtle. It was meant to remind everyone that, in her eyes, I would never measure up. I focused on caring for Lumi, smiling whenever someone admired her and keeping my emotions hidden. I refused to let my daughter remember a mother who answered cruelty with anger. What hurt most wasn't Marlene's behavior alone. It was the silence surrounding it. Every person at that gathering heard the insults. They saw the embarrassment on my face. Yet they lowered their eyes, changed the subject, or busied themselves with plates and decorations. Not one voice interrupted the humiliation. Standing in a room full of people, I had never felt so completely alone. Dinner was finally ready and everyone gathered around the long dining table. The conversation remained polite, but it felt forced, as though every person in the room was carefully avoiding the tension that had been building all afternoon. I settled into my chair with Lumi resting peacefully in my arms. She was fascinated by the sparkling lights on the Christmas tree, happily reaching toward them with her tiny fingers. Watching her smile gave me a brief moment of peace. For a little while, everything seemed almost normal. Then Blaine's uncle leaned forward, looked at Lumi and smiled warmly. "She has Blaine's eyes," he said softly. "Every time she looks around the room, it's like seeing him again." Several relatives nodded and I felt my heart tighten. It was a beautiful thing to hear because I missed my husband every single day. I thought the comment might remind everyone that Lumi was a precious part of Blaine still living among us. Instead, I watched Marlene's expression change. The warmth disappeared from her face. Her hands gripped the edge of the table and her breathing grew heavier. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp enough to silence every conversation. "That's exactly what you've been doing," she said while staring directly at me. "You keep bringing that baby here so nobody forgets you." I blinked in disbelief. "Marlene," I said quietly, "that's not true." She ignored me. "You think carrying my granddaughter into this house gives you a place in this family," she continued. "Every holiday has become another reminder of what I lost, and you're the one making it impossible to move forward." The room became painfully still. I searched the faces around the table, hoping someone would speak up. Nobody did. A few people stared at their plates. Others looked toward the window as though they hadn't heard a word. Their silence hurt almost as much as the accusation itself. Then Marlene stood so suddenly that her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She pointed toward the front door with a trembling hand. "Take your daughter and get out," she screamed. "Neither of you belongs in my house." The words echoed through the dining room. Lumi startled at the sound and began to cry. I gently held her against my shoulder, whispering softly until she settled. My own eyes filled with tears, but I refused to argue. There was nothing I could say that would change Marlene's heart in that moment. I slowly stood, picked up the diaper bag beside my chair and looked around the table one last time. "Thank you for dinner," I said as calmly as I could. No one answered. Leaving behind every wrapped present I had carefully chosen, I carried my daughter out of the house, closed the front door behind me, and walked into the cold Christmas night, believing that chapter of our lives had finally come to an end. The windshield wipers pushed away thick flakes of snow as I drove through the quiet streets with Lumi sleeping peacefully in her car seat behind me. Christmas lights glowed from houses we passed, and families gathered around warm windows, laughing together while I struggled to keep my emotions under control. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I replayed every painful moment from the dinner table. No matter how hard I tried, Marlene's words refused to leave my mind. I stopped at a red light and glanced into the rearview mirror. Lumi looked so calm, completely unaware of the hurtful scene she had just been part of. Seeing her peaceful face reminded me that my responsibility wasn't to win anyone's approval anymore. My job was to protect her from the kind of bitterness we had just experienced. As the light turned green, a sudden thought hit me. The Christmas card. I felt my stomach sink. In all the confusion, I had forgotten the handmade card beneath the tree. It was supposed to be Lumi's very first Christmas gift to her grandmother. I remembered helping her make the tiny red handprint, laughing when she wiggled her fingers and smeared a little paint across the paper. It wasn't perfect, but that was exactly what made it special. There could never be another first Christmas card. For several seconds, I considered turning the car around. Maybe I could quietly walk back inside, pick it up, and leave without saying a word. Then I shook my head. Someone who could look at her own 6-month-old granddaughter and order her out of the house didn't deserve something created with so much love. That little card carried more than paint and paper. It held hope, forgiveness, and a child's unconditional affection. I wasn't going to beg anyone to accept it. I kept driving. Back at the house, the atmosphere remained painfully quiet. Plates were still on the table, but almost nobody was eating anymore. The joyful mood that had filled the home only hours earlier had completely disappeared. Conversations faded into awkward silence, and every person seemed uncomfortable with what had happened. As everyone sat there avoiding eye contact, Blaine's aunt noticed a small white envelope resting beside the unopened presents under the Christmas tree. "Oh," she said softly, picking it up. "Greer must have forgotten this when she left." Without thinking anything of it, she carried the envelope across the room and placed it into Marlene's hands. "It's probably your Christmas card from Lumi," she said gently. Marlene stared at the envelope without opening it right away. No one around the table realized they were looking at something far more powerful than a simple holiday card. Within moments, those few forgotten pages would force every person in that room to confront a truth they had been avoiding all evening. Marlene held the envelope in her hands for a few moments without saying anything. Her expression remained distant, as though she expected nothing more than another ordinary Christmas card. Around the table, nobody spoke. The earlier argument had drained every bit of warmth from the room. Even the holiday music playing softly in the background now seemed strangely out of place. Finally, she slid one finger beneath the flap and opened the envelope. She pulled out the folded card and slowly opened it. On the front was Lumi's tiny red handprint pressed onto white paper. Above it, written in careful lettering, were the simple words, "Merry Christmas, Grandma." For a brief second, Marlene simply stared at the little handprint. It was so small that it barely covered the center of the page. Tiny fingerprints marked the edges where Lumi had curled her fingers before the paint dried. It wasn't perfect, but it carried the unmistakable touch of a 6-month-old child. One of Blaine's cousins noticed writing on the back. "I think there's something else here," she said quietly. Marlene didn't respond. The cousin gently turned the card over and read the message aloud, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Grandma, I love you even when you're mad. Merry Christmas. Love, Lumi." The words floated through the dining room. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for another bite of food. The silence felt heavier than anything that had been said all evening. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Marlene. She looked back at the tiny red handprint, her fingers beginning to tremble around the edges of the card. Her breathing became uneven as the meaning of those innocent words settled into her heart. For months, she had convinced herself that her anger was directed only at Greer. She blamed her for surviving when Blaine hadn't. She told herself that keeping Greer at a distance would somehow make the grief easier to carry. But the card stripped away every excuse. She hadn't pushed away only her daughter-in-law. She had driven away the only living piece of her son. The little girl she had ordered out of her home carried Blaine's smile, his eyes, and his future. Instead of welcoming that gift, she had treated her granddaughter like a stranger. A tear landed on the paper. Then another. Marlene pressed the card against her chest as a quiet sob escaped her lips. Years of anger collapsed beneath the weight of a few innocent words written for a child who had offered nothing except love. The room remained silent as she broke down completely, realizing that the greatest wound she had created that Christmas wasn't her own. It was the one she had inflicted on the family Blaine left behind. Marlene's shoulders shook as she held the Christmas card against her chest. Tears streamed down her face and no one around the table knew what to say. The silence that had protected everyone's comfort only moments earlier now felt unbearable. Every person sitting there understood they had witnessed something far bigger than a family argument. The truth they had avoided for months could no longer be ignored. Her older brother slowly set down his fork and looked around the room before speaking. "Blaine used to tell me he had one fear," he said quietly. "He wasn't afraid of hard work or raising a family. He always said that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped we'd stay together. He never wanted the people he loved to turn against each other." His words hung heavily in the air. No one argued because everyone remembered Blaine saying similar things over the years. Family had always mattered to him more than anything else. A few chairs away, Marlene's sister wiped her eyes before finding the courage to speak. "We all watched this happen," she admitted. "Every holiday, every visit, every phone call became harder for Greer. We saw the criticism. We heard the comments. We knew she was trying her best after losing Blaine." She paused, ashamed. "But none of us stepped in." Her voice cracked as she continued. "We stayed quiet because every time someone disagreed with you, Marlene, it ended with shouting. It seemed easier to avoid another fight than to defend someone who needed us." The confession opened a door that could no longer be closed. One relative after another admitted they had failed Greer. Blaine's cousin lowered his head and said he should have spoken up the first time Marlene blamed Greer for Blaine's death. His aunt admitted she often wanted to comfort Greer but convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere. Another family member quietly confessed that pretending nothing was wrong had become a habit because facing the truth felt uncomfortable. Each apology carried the same painful message. They hadn't wounded Greer with harsh words. They had hurt her by offering none at all. Marlene listened without interrupting. Every confession forced her to face the damage that had spread far beyond her own anger. The family's silence had allowed the cruelty to continue, but she knew where it had begun. She had created an atmosphere where kindness became difficult and fear replaced honesty. Looking at the tiny handprint once more, she realized grief had never given her permission to push away the people Blaine loved most. Others had remained silent, but she was the one who opened that door. Now she had to accept the painful truth that healing could never begin until she accepted responsibility for everything she had set in motion. I carefully buckled Lumi into her car seat, making sure her tiny blanket was tucked around her to keep out the cold. She had stopped crying and was already growing sleepy, her little eyes slowly closing as the warmth inside the car surrounded her. I brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead and smiled. She had no idea how much my heart had been tested that evening, and I silently hoped she would never remember any part of it. I closed the back door, walked around to the driver's seat and sat there without starting the engine. Snowflakes drifted past the windshield while the neighborhood remained peaceful. Only a few minutes earlier I thought I would be overwhelmed with tears. Instead I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because the evening had gone well. It had been the worst Christmas of my life. Yet somewhere between leaving that house and sitting behind the steering wheel, I finally accepted a truth I had been fighting ever since Blaine died. No matter how patient I was, no matter how respectful I remained, I couldn't make someone love me. Kindness could be offered freely, but acceptance could never be demanded. I had spent months hoping that one more visit, one more thoughtful gesture, or one more holiday would change Marlene's heart. Instead, each attempt left me feeling smaller than before. I looked at Lumi through the rearview mirror. "You'll never have to earn love," I whispered. "Not from anyone." At that moment I made a promise to my daughter and to myself. We would never again chase approval from people who chose anger over compassion. Our lives would be built around those who welcomed us, not those who constantly reminded us we didn't belong. That decision lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I reached for the key, but before I could pull away I heard someone calling my name. I looked up and saw Blaine's aunt hurrying across the snowy driveway, waving for me to wait. She stopped beside my window, breathing heavily. "Greer," she said softly, "please come back inside. Marlene wants to see you." I listened quietly before shaking my head. "If she's truly sorry," I replied, "she knows where Lumi and I live. Christmas isn't the time to fix this. We all need space." There was no anger in my voice, only calm certainty. His aunt nodded with tears in her eyes because she understood. I started the engine and slowly drove away. For the first time since losing Blaine, I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was choosing self-respect, protecting my daughter, and refusing to sacrifice my dignity just to be accepted by someone who had not yet learned how to give love. After Greer's car disappeared down the street, the house felt strangely empty. The laughter that had filled every room before dinner was gone, replaced by a silence that seemed impossible to escape. Marlene remained in her chair, still holding Lumi's Christmas card against her chest as though letting go of it would make her lose the last connection she had to her son. She closed her eyes, and memories she had buried beneath months of anger began returning one after another. She remembered the afternoon Blaine first introduced Greer to the family. He couldn't stop smiling as he slipped his arm around her shoulders. "This is the best thing that's ever happened to me," he had said proudly. "I hope all of you love her the way I do." At the time, Marlene had smiled back and welcomed Greer into the family. She remembered helping them prepare for their wedding, celebrating birthdays together, and dreaming about the grandchildren they might have someday. Then everything changed the day Blaine died. Instead of accepting the unbearable truth that her son would never walk through her front door again, she searched for somewhere to place her pain. Greer became the easiest target. Every time she looked at her daughter-in-law, she was reminded of the future Blaine would never get to live. Rather than facing her grief, she convinced herself that pushing Greer away would somehow make the heartbreak easier to carry. Now, with Lumi's tiny red handprint resting beneath her fingers, that illusion finally collapsed. She hadn't been protecting herself. She had been driving away the only living piece of Blaine she still had. Fresh tears streamed down her face as she realized how close she had come to losing her granddaughter completely. If Greer decided never to return, Marlene would have nobody to blame except herself. "I'm so sorry," she whispered through quiet sobs, though the people who truly needed to hear those words were already gone. Around the table no one reached for dessert. The pies, cookies, and cakes prepared for the celebration remained untouched. Wrapped presents stayed beneath the tree exactly where they had been placed earlier that afternoon. Suddenly, exchanging gifts seemed meaningless. One by one, relatives quietly gathered their coats without speaking. A few hugged Marlene before leaving, while others simply nodded with sad expressions. No one knew how to repair what had happened that night, and nobody wanted to pretend everything was normal. As the front door closed behind the last family member, the Christmas lights continued to glow around the room, but they could not brighten the overwhelming regret that filled the house. Marlene sat alone with the framed memories of her son, finally understanding that grief had almost cost her the chance to know the granddaughter he had loved before she was even born. 3 days after Christmas, there was a gentle knock at my apartment door. I had just finished feeding Lumi and was rocking her to sleep when I heard it. Through the peephole I saw Marlene standing in the hallway. She wasn't alone. Beside her were several gift bags filled with every present I had left behind that night. In her hands she carried something wrapped carefully in brown paper. For a moment I considered pretending I wasn't home. Instead I opened the door. Neither of us spoke right away. Marlene looked tired. The confidence she had carried for months had disappeared, replaced by quiet regret. She held out the wrapped package first. "I wanted you to have this," she said softly. I removed the paper and found Lumi's Christmas card inside a simple glass frame. Her tiny red handprint rested safely behind the clear glass, protected instead of forgotten. Looking at it made my eyes fill with tears, but I stayed silent. Next, Marlene handed me the bags containing every gift I had brought to Christmas dinner. "I should never have sent you away," she said. "What I did was cruel. You didn't deserve it and neither did Lumi." She paused before continuing. "I'm not here to blame my grief. I'm not asking you to excuse my behavior because I lost Blaine. None of that changes what I said to you. I was wrong." Those words caught me by surprise because they were honest. She wasn't defending herself or asking for immediate forgiveness. She accepted responsibility without expecting anything in return. I listened until she finished. Then I took a slow breath. "I appreciate your apology," I said calmly. "Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive you completely. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing." She nodded without interrupting. "If you want a relationship with Lumi, it has to be built from this moment forward. She deserves people who make her feel loved every single time they see her." I looked directly into her eyes. "No more insults." She lowered her head. "No more humiliation." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And no more expecting another chance without proving you've changed." She quietly whispered, "I understand. For now," I continued, "visits will happen when I'm comfortable. They'll be short and they'll happen because they're healthy for Lumi, not because anyone feels entitled to them. If respect disappears, the visits stop." Marlene agreed without arguing. As she walked away, I realized something important. I hadn't raised my voice or tried to hurt her the way she had hurt me. I simply refused to surrender my self-respect again. Setting firm boundaries protected my daughter, honored my own worth, and ensured that any place in our lives would have to be earned through consistent actions instead of empty promises. That was the greatest victory I could have hoped for. The months that followed didn't erase the pain of that Christmas, but they slowly revealed whether Marlene's apology had been sincere. She never demanded another opportunity or complained about the boundaries I had set. Instead, she respected every one of them. When we agreed on a short visit, she arrived on time. If I said Lumi was tired, she smiled, gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead and quietly went home. She stopped expecting trust to return overnight and understood that rebuilding a relationship required patience. Little by little I noticed the difference. She no longer spoke to me with anger or bitterness. There were no sarcastic remarks, unfair comparisons, or hurtful comments disguised as jokes. She treated me with the same courtesy she wanted in return. More importantly, she focused on being present for Lumi instead of trying to rewrite the past. Every visit became another chance to prove that her actions matched her words. As Lumi grew, she laughed whenever her grandmother read picture books, clapped along to children's songs, or chased bubbles across the living room. Watching them together reminded me of the family Blaine had always dreamed his daughter would have. The relationship wasn't perfect, but it was finally built on honesty instead of resentment. The framed Christmas card never left Marlene's fireplace. Every time I visited, it stood in the same place with Lumi's tiny red handprint preserved behind the glass. It wasn't displayed as decoration. It served as a quiet reminder of the evening when a child's innocent message exposed the cost of unchecked grief and the importance of choosing compassion before pride. Sometimes Marlene would pause in front of it for a few seconds before greeting us. She never needed to explain why. We both understood what it represented. Looking back now, I realize my greatest victory had nothing to do with seeing Marlene cry at the dinner table. That moment wasn't something to celebrate. Real healing began when I refused to answer cruelty with more cruelty. I protected my daughter without teaching her to hate. I chose healthy boundaries instead of endless arguments, and that decision changed every relationship that followed. Christmas had started with rejection, heartbreak, and painful words none of us could take back. Yet it ended by teaching our family something far more valuable than any present under the tree. Love cannot survive where respect is missing. Forgiveness takes time, trust must be earned, and accountability is the first step toward real change. Because we finally accepted those truths, Lumi grew up surrounded not by bitterness, but by people who learned that the strongest families are built through humility, kindness, and the courage to become better than they were yesterday. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying with me until the end, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this.